Well, foreign aid has hardly been a popular topic in recent years, even less so when people up and down the country are struggling. Well, having promised to overhaul foreign aid and stop sending cheques to despots to afford private jets and Gucci loafers, or countries that seem to find coins down the back of the sofa for space rockets, the government scrapped the International Development Department and lumped it in with the Foreign Office to make sure that what we do send abroad fits with an overarching strategy. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is facing scrutiny today over her Trade for Aid programme, which critics say mirrors the sinister predatory mercantilism of China's Belt and Road Initiative, where Beijing builds massive infrastructure projects in the developing world with pretty hefty conditions. But isn't that the point? Was letting the Communist Party of China lay roads and railways, and in doing so, pretty deep routes around the Commonwealth, really a good idea? As a result, Beijing has gobbled up 90% of the planet's rare earth minerals and is owed debt equivalent to 5% of global GDP, around $1.5 trillion from 150 countries, making China the world's largest creditor, bigger than the World Bank, the IMF and all the OECD governments put together. And in a modern, globalised world, that is some pretty scary leverage. Well, the Foreign Secretary is currently being questioned by the International Development Committee. She's expected to answer questions on the UK's foreign aid programme. Well, let's speak now to Gwydion Prinz, research professor at the London School of Economics and former advisor to the MOD, NATO and the UN. Gwydion, great to have you on the programme. Normally we're talking Ukraine, but you're a bit of an expert in this department as well. People often raise eyebrows at foreign aid and say, well, we shouldn't be sending any money abroad, especially during a cost of living crisis. But do you think this is basically essential soft diplomacy, especially with the might of Beijing taking over vast swathes of Africa?
Well, you took my breath away with that brilliant summary that you just gave, Alex. You don't leave me much to say. Of course, we should be using our money as part of the enlargement of the interests of our state. That doesn't mean to say that we're in any sense going to be ungenerous or that we are going to do what the Chinese communists do. And you're right. I mean, I started my career working in the African bush a long, long time ago. And my wife and I were living there when the Chinese were starting their first campaign of entering Africa and building really rather second-rate roads and railways, and then trapping countries in debt. A much more recent example is what they've done to Sri Lanka, where they persuaded the Sri Lankans to build an enormous port at a place called Hamintota. The port was really pointless. The Sri Lankans couldn't afford the interest payments. And so after a period, the People's Republic of China very generously said, well, since you can't afford to pay for the port, we'll just take it over, thanks. We'll take it as an asset. And now it becomes an available port for the People's Liberation Army Navy. So if that isn't old-fashioned imperialism, I don't know what is.
Hasn't there been something similar happening in the Solomon Islands as well, with Chinese aid, and all of a sudden, hey presto, you suddenly find a Chinese naval base there?
Well, look, this is just a further extension of what they've been doing in the South China Sea. They jumped onto these coral reefs, which were uninhabited, called the Spratly Islands. And then before you knew where we were, they were concreted over and they had air bases on them, and they were claiming them under the so-called 9-dash line as being part of territorial waters of China. But it happened to be most of the South China Sea. Now, we don't accept that. And we are constantly sending our navies, with increasing strength, I'm glad to say, to challenge that claim. When HMS Queen Elizabeth went on her maiden cruise to the Far East, that's exactly where she went. And in company with 5 Western fleets, she challenged these Chinese claims to sovereignty. But this is going to be part of the next phase, which we've been taking our eyes off whilst we've looked at Ukraine. But, Alex, there is an old Chinese proverb which says, point at the mulberry bush to curse the lotus tree, which means that there is a link between Ukraine and China. And it's this, which is that the extraordinary performance of the West and of NATO in showing the way that we are being prepared to support the Ukrainians and to face down Mr. Putin is actually also a deterrent message to Mr. Xi Jinping and his imperial pretensions, predating into areas of the Commonwealth and of the Pacific in particular.